Good morning, friends and family. It is Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you will be freer after this hour with Stewart and El-Mekki and me. Today we are talking about how we can decolonize education for our children and turn it into liberatory education. But we are seeing it through the lens of the commonalities between indigenous cultures who have been colonized, diasporic people who have been abducted and then colonized, taken to colonies and colonized, and then all of us together who exist within colonial education systems without any sense of whether or not we are indigenous or diasporic or whatever. We're kind of a amalgamation, I can't think of the word, of things and problems in one education system. Before we get started, I want to say to everybody, we know that this is a meaty topic. We are not going to beat it up today. We're not going to be able to get to everything in it. If you have any thoughts or resources, papers, studies, research, this is a communal learning opportunity. So as you participate in the discussion today, drop it into the comments. Anything that you have that adds heft and weight to the discussion, because we are people who read and we are an intellectual people. Doesn't mean we know everything. We are still learning, and we're going to learn together on this one today. Yeah. Sharif, good morning, brother. How you doing?
Good, man. Good morning. Good to see you. Happy Friday. September is here.
It's here.
My favorite season. Nice fall. Look forward to the weather change. And then also, of course, we all are thinking about, Jackson, Mississippi, and all the connection between, racism and injustices that continue to plague, as we export American exceptionalism. You tweeted something out like, yeah, what'd you say about shithole countries? Like, yeah,
I mean, that's so funny, isn't it? Like, we are a colonial empire who likes to call other countries third world and savage and shithole countries. And we have an American city that can't flush its toilets. What? We got American cities that can't, even if they can flush their toilets, they don't have clean water and clean air.
Shower with your mouth closed.
Wow. I mean,
right? That's what they're telling people, like,
And that should be a check on us sometimes, to not get so lost in the sauce when it comes to Americanism in our country that we don't see our own inferior ways of being. Right. Like right now, there are rivers drying up that hundreds of millions of Americans depend on for their water. It's not just Jackson, Mississippi. This is a problem. Right. Yeah. And it's not getting better. And we don't have the type of leaders or leadership that are prone to solving problems. They can beat on their chest about American exceptionalism all they want. They're not producing solutions for real people. Yeah. Nowhere is that more apparent than education. So what do you think about this topic, first of all? The way I set it up is thinking about indigenous cultures and their relationship to land and their power and their education. Diasporic people, which are people that live within the diaspora who have been scattered to other places. So African Americans, African descended people were captured and transferred all around the world as like a product. And now we live in the aftermath of that. We live in a diaspora. I think a lot of Negropeans wake up every morning not knowing that they're part of a diaspora. They
like, you might get a smack for that. No, I'm not connected to y'all.
I am American. Really? And then somewhere else someone's saying, well, I am Jamaican. And someone else is saying, I am British, and they are all part of a similar system that scattered people to the four corners of the earth. And then there's this, like, if we look at the American education system, the New Zealand education system, even the Mexican education system, the Canadian, what they all have in common is that they all were set up by colonial rule, and their main way of dealing with Native people or non-colonial people was to assimilate them, to change them. Boarding schools were a big part of that. And the mission of the boarding school in colonial countries could not have been more clear. Take them from their parents at an early age, take the kids from the parents at an early age, retrain them in the ways of Eurocentric values and Eurocentric affects, and then send them back to their people as a completely renewed product, to be a native face for the colonial race. Is that fair?
Yeah, and the other part of that was kill the rest. Like, and if you couldn't inject them, and I read something a couple months ago where they were just continuing to discover grave sites of children, near or adjacent to these boarding schools. So that continuation, and you saw the same thing whether it's a boarding school, whether it's a plantation, very similar, ideology, right? White supremacy is what fueled all of these type of mindsets, right? And if they resist too much, if they can't, you try to beat them to submission, torture them to submission, and then ultimately kill them if the difference was it wasn't like, maybe I mean, and I don't put anything past these guys, but where in America you might get sold to the deep south if you were in Maryland or Delaware, right? North Carolina was like a place that was even worse. With boarding schools, I don't know if they did those kind of transfers, but the fact that these were children that were taken. If people have not seen Rabbit Proof Fence, very similar in Australia, with the Aborigines and what they were doing, same type of thing. But as Biko said it, right, the most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressors, the mind of the oppressed, the minds of our children. And so they would go all out to change, to what you used to say, like inject something in the software, into the hardware. Same thing, but just like with some really dire consequences that last for generations. Because anything you teach, like we talk to our Freedom School apprentices, these high school and college folks, and we're like, you know what, the first, second, and third graders that you're teaching, yes, you're teaching them, but you're impacting their grandchildren. Well, on the flip side, it's the same thing. Flip side is the same thing.
I mean, that's something that we have to think about even as parents. Everything I do for you as my child, I'm doing for my grandchildren.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And not only for your grandchildren, for your child's grandchildren, really your great grandchildren.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so when they talk about like 7 generations, like that's how we should be thinking. Whatever we're doing, we should really be thinking about, like, does this positively impact or negatively impact 7 generations from now? And that's how you stay connected to history, present, as well as the future, and realizing like our actions, our decisions, our framing, our systems, it's not just impacting what we see right now, and it's not some esoteric thing. This is reality. We know right now what people did that's currently impacting us today.
Do we though?
We should. We can ignore it at our own peril.
I always wonder sometimes if we really do know.
I mean, a lot of people want to run away from it, right? But we also know that, hey, you know what? That GI Bill that was first created, that impacts us. That, that whole Reconstruction decision to end it, in that backdoor deal, it still has an impact. Jackson, Flint, Philadelphia, water supplies, ghettoizing communities, still impacting.
How we talk about a curriculum or a knowledge-rich curriculum, and we talk about a knowledge-rich education. And typically when people talk about a knowledge-rich education, they are not talking about a culturally knowledge-rich curriculum. They're talking about a generically knowledge-rich curriculum. And by generically,
what you need to know to be American and adjacent to us, the
Western canon.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So they're talking oftentimes about, you just mentioned the word, implanting an operating system into our hardware, which is a Western identity, a Western sense of belonging, a sense of a Western canon, and the primacy of that canon over all the rest of the world fund of information. So they are selling you, basically marketing to you, what they want you to believe is the best that has been written, the best that has been thought, the best that has been constructed in terms of knowledge. And if you are an uncritical consumer of what they consider to be a knowledge-rich education, you can come out dumb as hell if the goal is to understand all of the world and all of world history, like humanity, human civilization. There is no way of telling any story about your place in the world in the past without understanding the Asian or Palestinian or Latin American or sub-Saharan African. Those things are part of the World Fund of Information. And if you just chop them off, you're kind of like well, we have said it, you are a Negropean.
Yeah.
Which is not the goal, right? That is not our goal.
For some folks, that is exactly what they're aspired to be.
That's what they want.
Yeah. I've arrived. I'm a Negropean now.
I've arrived. That's the saddest part, is when you're proud of it. Like,
listen, they out there, bro. Matter of fact, they probably coming for us every other day. You know what I'm saying?
I will say it jokingly sometimes, right? But I'm always joking. So I want people to know on this show, whenever I jokingly refer to even myself as a Negropean, I'm referring to myself as not a fully liberated being who is acknowledging the places where I'm not a fully liberated being. I want to not go too deep on Indigenous education, but I do think it's a good starting point, because Indigenous folks are in a constant fight for their language, their culture, their heritage, their understanding of the world, their worldview, and it is very deeply connected to land in their mind. Their struggle and their liberationist struggle is not separate from their connection to the earth and to the land and to the place that they inhabit, which makes their liberationist struggle a little different than diasporic people who've been scattered all around the world. But I do want to jump to diasporic people who've been captured somewhere and have been scattered like we have, African descended people. What does it mean for our education liberationist philosophy if we don't have the connection to the land, if that's not part of our struggle, and we're not really firmly rooted in something that connects us to the land in the way that the indigenous struggle does?
Yeah, that's such a really interesting question, Chris. And I think I would imagine that that's some of what, like, Marcus Garvey, Republic of New Africa, they were saying, like, you have to be. I remember in one of Malcolm's speeches, he was talking about any revolution, it's about land. He's like, you can't have a revolution if you're not talking about land. And the sovereignty on that land, and sovereignty not just meaning the physical nature of the earth in that space, but also like what you do on that earth, how you educate, right? That's the the green and the red, black, the RBG, red, black, and green, right? Like, we used to sing, red, black, and green is me, red, black, and green, yay bo, right? Like, that green is the land. And I think it's for us, it's a little bit more complex because it's the connection to our roots, as well as where we are now, what we built here. So we're kind of, in a way, in no man's land, but you can't stay in no man's land, mentally. It's one thing doing that physically and all the other things, but if you're in no man's lands mentally, you're dooming, yourself, right? Like, because there's no bearing. You got literally intellectual, cultural vertigo, and you can't get a grounding, right? And that is has an impact. And people are still functional with cultural vertigo. They're functioning in a way, but they're doing so much damage. If they're leading classrooms, they're doing damage. If they have access to policy making, they're doing damage, right? And so that piece, that connection to the land is so much big. Yes, we need land and that kind of ownership, even though that would be counter to how the Native Americans looked at it originally, right? But currently, like, that is a gateway to other levels of security. But
wow. So you said so many things in there. Cultural vertigo.
Yeah.
We're going to have to really keep thinking about that as a concept. And this connection to the land premise. It's good for everyone. This isn't just a liberationist strategy. All people should understand their connection to the land. The further away you get from your food source or from your source of life and the meditative ability to get lost in the woods or get lost in real earth.
Mhm.
And the more you're in this kind of like synthetic world of, air conditioning and just
That's what
conditioning,
this
period.
synthetic world. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. The more you feel like the synthetic world is real and the other world isn't. And then you start having synthetic values and synthetic, operating ideas,
Bro,
Um,
the whole fact that you can live your whole reality sitting on the couch with some daggone goggles on, like to me, that's the scariest thing in the world, right? Like that is
yeah,
literally when all the research,
yeah.
all the research talks about the impact on your psyche, your thinking, all that, just to be in nature, to feel the sun, to see
Mhm,
something green or brown, whatever the color is, in nature, right?
mhm,
Its natural state. And then you look at this generation
mhm,
with higher levels of anxiety, depression, feeling isolated, all the things that is opposite, but yet it's more and more is being pumped to them to, hey, disconnect even more. It's like
mhm,
calling them,
mhm,
disconnect from other people even more, disconnect from nature even more, right? Like, and they're doing it in this fun, appealing way. I'm just like, yo, like this is an absolute disaster.
mhm,
um
mhm.
and already saying like, oh yeah, they're the most anxiety ridden generation. I'm like, yeah, like they're by themselves, being tricked into thinking they're in community. You're not in community.
Mhm, mhm.
They literally said they want you to scroll, not even go deep, right? Like not even this intellectual rigor analysis. They want you to actually just look. Like that's crazy. That's crazy.
So funny you should say the with this motion there because doom scrolling in Twitter, doom scrolling in Facebook, doom
What's that?
scrolling.
What's doom scrolling?
Well, you're just kind of like you're going deeper and deeper scrolling, and time is passing by. But a lot of the information that you're taking in gets more and more negative too. Like your
Hmm.
fears are being exercised.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Your hatred. The more you scroll, your algorithm starts to change to an angry algorithm.
Wow.
I just said to somebody
That's
recently,
nuts,
actually in this last week, I said it twice. I can remember life before the algorithm,
man.
meaning I can remember life before it was possible to have a completely designer reality,
Mm.
before, like you could have your own news and your news said just what you wanted it to say.
Right.
No connection to facts or whatever. You could just have,
Yeah.
if you want news that tells you my oft repeated example, the Marjorie Taylor Greene comment that the wildfires were started by Jewish ray beams shot from the sky.
Mm.
And there was a whole group of people who did not question that in her feed, in her algorithm.
So
Uh,
this is like the real, like somebody put this out, and people are just like,
Not only somebody, a sitting United States congressperson,
oh, that's who that is. All right.
right? A sitting United States congressperson put out or posited the suggestion that California wildfires were not started by climate change that has been driven by bad behavior, economic behavior, and capitalism, but was started by Jewish ray beams shot from the sky.
See, and we only talk about the mental health of Gen Z. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like we need to expand, like,
And
what,
Gen Z's like, no, no, this is pretty much man-made. This is a
yeah.
man-made problem. There's no
Right.
ray beams. I don't know what you older people are smoking. Something's
Uh,
wrong. But that's because of an algorithm, and that algorithm is new in technology of how effective it can be to train whole groups of people to think really stupid things. But the American education system and public schooling, along with the Canadian public schooling and New Zealand public schooling and the UK's public schooling, are all some form of operating system algorithm building in whole populations of people that have
mhm.
retrained their thinking away from their connection to the land, their connection to their roots, the connection to the earth, the connection to their own ideas about the world, their native ways of seeing the world.
Right.
Wherever you live in the world, if you are part of a native population that still has some of that within your control, as many places do, you're living somewhat of an organic lifestyle. But we're taught to think that they're inferior.
Oh, yeah,
I mean,
100%.
aren't we? I mean, we're taught to
Oh
think they're
yeah.
primitive and they're backwards and they're inferior.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and this and I mean, talking about like Congress people saying stuff and people flocking to it. For hundreds of years, people in Congress would say things like, black people are inferior, and people would flock to it. They just didn't have the wildfire of an internet to chase it, but that mindset sure went from coast to coast, pretty radically. Even places, what was that, Oregon, where no enslavement, but you're black, you can't live here, right? Like, so that same type of inferiority. And I think this is why the education piece is so important. This is why Marcus Garvey talked about, if you do not know, any people who do not know their history is like a tree without roots, right? Like you just can't grow, you can't thrive, you can't even survive. A tree can't survive without roots. And the same, people not having some type of mechanism to filter the anti-blackness, the anti-indigenous, the Latino mentality, and just like onslaught. It's an onslaught. Like, that's what you have to recognize. Like, you're in a constant onslaught of messages that you have no culture, you have no community, you have no and then also measure that with who's that, Toni Morrison, who was like, the purpose of racism is to keep distracting you. It says you don't have culture, and then you're running, going in the basement, looking, doing research, like, see, I have culture. Oh, you have no language. Oh, let me run. Like, just keeps distracting you, where you're going to keep trying to prove your humanity. And they're like, you can't prove your humanity, you can only defend it. Your humanity, you just have to know that you have it, you have a culture, you have existence. And so I'm always in between there, like, which part is a distraction, because they're constantly saying something. Like, when do you check their chin and fire back, and when do you just like, listen, we know perfectly well that they're idiots, and we're just going to keep it moving, keep building, right? And then when time do you pause and fire back and say, like, no, you don't know what you're talking about, and then get back to work, right? And so we're always in this constant motion. And I think about, like, what Tony said, and then I also think about, like, some of this stuff you gotta defend it. But I think, and I don't, I still will probably spend years thinking about this, but I think the best way to defend our humanity is making sure that our children and their grandchildren are fully equipped to understand that they have history, culture, and everything that other people say about us is a lie, and it's based on a lie, and it's based to fuel and feed their system. You're muted.
Oh, to friends and family watching this right now, I'll say this. Please drop in any resource that you have into the comments. Studies, papers, your favorite book on any of the things that we're talking about today: Indigenous education, diasporic education, colonial footprint on American public education. And we will get to this liberatory education. Drop the resources in the comments, and we will definitely make them part of our ongoing study guide from Freedom Fridays. So, Sharif, if you are having, I came across this word. I love words. Like a person that loves words. So as I'm reading and preparing for some of these things, there's a couple words that stuck out into something I was reading when it was talking about the Native American. I don't know if this is American. It's definitely a Native population somewhere. It talked about the ethnocidal assimilation, ethnocidal assimilation, and that you needed to get from ethnocidal assimilation to emancipatory ideologies that lead you to sovereignty, self-determination, and cultural revalorization.
Cultural what?
Revalorization.
Okay.
I'm like, man, see, some of y'all with your fancy book learning go places, and I need to dig in on some of these things, right?
Yeah.
I think I know what cultural revalorization means. In some ways, well, we could come back to that. But this ethnocidal assimilation seems like when you take Native babies away from their parents and put them in boarding schools, as did most countries, not just the United States, not just Canada, but globally this happened. You're taking them at an early age on purpose, because you know that that's the time where you can, so-called in America, they called it, kill the Indian, save the man, or save the child, or whatnot. That was the premise of the colonial education project, which continues today.
And probably, and
Yeah,
it
so
was probably not probably, and it was championed in Congress or the Parliament and whatever they have in
absolutely.
Canada as well, right? Like so.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, there was, a guy, and I'm going to forget his name right now in the United States, and I can pull it up later, who championed Indian education and wanted an American outlay, like wanted to pay for it, wanted to get the money to put. And you would think, oh wow, this is a good thing. This was one of the early champions of Indian education. He really wanted to, so he set up the systems and whatnot. And really, if you read deeply, it was a very paternalist, kill the Indian, save the man type of project, to take them from being savage, uncivilized people and to put them into civilization. That was really the whole premise of his wanting to start Indian schools. And that premise hasn't died. Today when people talk about integration, for instance, I'll use this as an example. Too many Black kids in one school. And the idea that the research that
They like it's too many Black people, period. That's
too
what
many
they
Black
feel.
people, that this is true, but you will have progressive, college educated educators who believe in the scientific racism of pure effects and the eternal deficiency of non-white kids, and the solution of mixing them in with good kids, which are white kids, kids that aren't culturally deficient in other ways. That is also a version of the kill the Indian, save the man story, and it's not an illiberal premise. It's a progressive. It's a part of the progressive education platform, pure effects or whatnot. So we're still believing some of these things. I mean, you are kind of bucking the system here in your thought that, number one, you went to schools where Black kids can learn. So let's just get some of the scientific racism out of the way, where the pure effects didn't stop you from getting an education. And you are focusing on schools now where, well, let me take a wild guess. I suppose that when you guys do freedom schools, or when you think about the center work that you are doing, you're not doing it with the idea that Black kids being together is culturally deficient and a problem.
Right. The exact opposite. It's like, yo, this is where you draw your strength, your community. We reinforce self-determination, we reinforce joy, like all of that. You know what? And it's all Black space. Like picture that, and make it normal. For them to be like, oh yeah, this is absolutely normal. So all the other messages that they're getting, that they're able to deflect and respond to, and not necessarily always again responding verbally like, oh yeah, yes we, like just in action. Just responding in action, like, nah, this is the space, and it's counter to all the messaging that they receive.
Do you think that if we put our kids into schools that are doing well with reading and math and some of the other things that we want in schools, do you think that if we find those schools and we have our kids in them, but they don't have a strong cultural orientation that spends much time thinking about how kids connect to their roots and to the earth and to their culture, and to indigenizing education specifically, but they are still successful with the reading, the math, the core subjects, is that enough?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to exactly what you said. I'm like, and plenty of people have to, they're making these individualized decisions, but as a group, as a community, as a people, I said, what's that term that you said?
Ethnocidal.
Ethnocidal assimilation.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine like that's what we're seeing. Right, like that's what we're seeing. Like that's what they're in. Because what happens is they become the message that they receive is like, this is the one, not only just a way, this is the only way. And that's where you start getting people who come out of that and be like, well, this is what I did, and nothing else matters. Like you get people on platforms saying there's no such thing as a positive all Black space. There's no such thing as a successful all Black school, right? Like we know people who say that, who believe that in their core. Why? Because of that ethnocidal assimilation that they experience. Yes, it was, they were teaching the English language well. They were teaching this well. They were teaching that. And mind you, like all the ways that well also can mean hella racist at the same time,
Mhm.
right? I'm saying
Mhm.
well in quotation marks. But anytime you go into a system where you literally come out believing that your own people is absolutely inferior, they've contributed nothing to civilization, that the best that they are stowaways to this American dream, that's
Mhm.
ethnocidal. Matter of fact, I love
Mhm.
that word. The more the more I roll it around on my tongue, like, yo,
Yeah.
like, yeah, that's exactly what we're seeing, and it's a acute danger to that,
Mhm.
and it's going to impact our grandkids. If enough of them are coming in and saying that. It's interesting. Every culture kind of has like this rejection of white supremacy. Black culture, they call it Oreo.
Mhm.
Some of the
Mhm.
Latinos call it a coconut, right?
Mhm.
Like it's
I've
it's
heard that
something else.
one.
I
Yeah.
forget what the Indian subcontinent, they
Yeah.
also had a term for, right? Like there's
Yeah.
people are talking about, like,
Asians call it a Twinkie.
yeah, like,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it's white supremacy in
Yeah.
infection. It's an infection. White
Mhm.
supremacy is a virus. And like, all right, are you, what do you have that's inoculating it yourself against it?
Let me double down on the question a little bit more, though. So you are sending an African American child, a child who is African descended but no longer thinks of themselves as connected to Africa. They
Hmm.
don't have many of the traditions and the ways of being African because over, a couple of hundred years, that has been replaced in their operating system with a Eurocentric kind of frame of thinking. You send them to a traditional American school
Hmm.
where they're having a traditional American experience every day. They're, they're blending in. They're, whatever. What's so wrong with them if they go to college and they don't pick up any of the other stuff, but they
Hmm.
go to college, they come out, they get a good job, a decent job, they
Hmm.
start working, they buy a house, they have a car, their kids are doing okay, they're fine. Maybe they work for UPS or maybe they work for Amazon or Accenture or somewhere. They've got just a good mainstream job. What's so wrong with that person who doesn't want to wear the dashiki, doesn't want to get their hands in the dirt, during the day? They don't want to be like you, Sharif, out there keeping bees and making honey. You know, what's so wrong with that person?
You know what? Nothing if they're still grounded in something. You got to be grounded in something. As a human being, your roots are going to take place in something. And my
Hmm.
question would be, what are your roots taking in? Too many of them, it's being nurtured by variances of white supremacy, right? Like
Hmm.
it is
Hmm.
literally thinking. Again, if you literally think like, oh, all of there are people when they said shithole countries, even if they didn't say it out loud, they're like, yeah, those
Hmm.
are shithole countries, right?
Hmm.
Like mentally, they've internalized it, even if they're too polite to say it out loud. They
Hmm.
believe it and they agree with it. And if you believe that about another country, you believe that about another community, even if
Well,
that's the community you came from, right? Because
and
country
you
is just
believe that
another word.
about the people here in this country who
That
are
exactly.
descended from those. Yeah, I mean,
That's exactly what I'm talking about. That
yeah,
community, you believe that about
yeah,
that community, that neighborhood.
yeah.
Now you're a policymaker. What's going to influence your policies?
Hmm.
You're
Hmm.
an educator. How are you going to teach the children if unconsciously as well as consciously, but reticent to say it out loud, but it sure is going to come through in your lesson plans. It sure is hell going to come through in your expectations. It
Hmm.
sure is going to come through in your relationships with kids and families, right? Like, so it's going to seep out. It's going to manifest itself in some way if your roots are situated just in this space,
Hmm.
and believing that, you know what, this is the assimilation that is the highest level of state of living and state of being. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, that is like we see it all the time, man. We see it all the time.
Hmm.
You're like, why? How did you sign off on it? Or why did you teach that? Or why does your bookshelf look that way? Or why are your tweets coming out that way? Like it is a constant barrage of not just from the right, but from the left as well, and all the
Hmm.
different messages, in between. And this is why, we have to just make sure like the self-determination, the understanding of the context that we're in, and what it all means. What does it all mean? Like, and yeah, so if I have a child in that space, making sure that we're constantly debriefing,
Hmm.
constantly
Hmm.
having conversations, not just how was school. No, I know every time, like I just sent you into, the lion's den. You know,
Mhm.
you went to
Mm.
school behind enemy, enemy lines. Now we need to, it's like, what do they call it? You know, after those hostages or something, anybody gets caught, or the soldier flies out of plane, they get captured,
Mhm.
but then they get released. They're like, they don't call it debrief. They call it something, right?
Is
Like
it
when
like
they,
deprogramming or something? It's
yeah,
like,
no, but it's
yeah,
something
yeah,
more
yeah,
benign. It's kind of
yeah,
like, it's like debriefing, right?
yeah, yeah,
Um, you better do that with your kids,
yeah.
when they coming back from school.
What
And
I
I'll
noticed
think of the
about
term though, but it's literally like, if hopefully Brittany Griner gets this up, they're gonna do something just to see
mhm,
what did that, about the experience, whatever. And I'll come up with the term. So maybe somebody in the audience knows, but that is the same
mhm.
kind of thing. Because your kid, even though you send them voluntarily, they're a little bit of hostage to white supremacist thought, ideology, and curricula.
Not a little bit. I mean, I think it's a lot. There's outright crazed white supremacy, which is your David Duke, Richard Spencer, the alt-right, the people that are just very okay with putting it out there. There's this middle passage of white supremacist thought and ideology, which has a lot of dog whistle languages, but nothing
Mhm.
outright so that you can't detect it as much. Like you look like a crazy person if you address it or attack it. And then there's this really kind of odorless, tasteless, more like a fart type of white supremacy, which you don't know where it came from, but it does stink to you. Like,
Like the
it came
cow
from
fart.
somewhere.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
those
kind of like,
red
yeah, like
the
there's
joint.
some,
They
there
showing
might not
how
be,
they pollute the earth. Maybe you
right.
should Google that. They have these infrared where they show how much gas cattle produce, and they're
Right.
like literally their whole air in those spaces is toxic because you can't see
Yeah.
it, but it's like massive, massive amount of gas from
This is why
hundreds of
people
thousands of
say
cattle.
meat eating is
Hmm.
producing like problems for the
Like, yeah,
environment,
the greenhouse gas, man. Yeah,
especially the
so
way
that's
that
the
we
same
do it.
type of
So,
thing for in our educational ecosystem, right?
So
A whole
there's the
bunch of that.
greenhouse gas kind of white supremacy, which it has plausible deniability of being real white supremacy. And there are even liberal, so-called liberal people participating in it. And I think school is a great place to examine that because there are kids walking in schools every day that they're not being taught about how those schools were constructed, where they came from, the history. I've said this a lot of times. The most ironic thing about public education is the one thing that it doesn't teach you about is public education. Like
Mhm.
this, the institution that you're actually in, it doesn't do any time having you think critically about who is your teacher, why are they there, how did they get there, who's the principal, how was the building designed, how's the money, where's the money come from, how the money moves, and all that stuff. It's just so weird that the one thing in public education that you don't learn is about the most important artery of learning in the United States, which is public
Mhm.
education. But I
Mhm.
want to go back to something around the original premise here. Native American and indigenous peoples all over the world have fought for their right as indigenous peoples to continue, number one, as themselves, their pre-colonial selves,
Mhm.
the way that they saw the world, their education, all that stuff. So their case is more clear, and in many places they have laws that determine who can teach them and how they can teach them. In the United
Right.
States, there are laws
The
protecting
level of
it, being
sovereignty.
education.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a level of like protection, like not just anybody can go teaching Indian students, Native American students without their express uh, collaboration in the process or whatever. They own more of the means of education. This is not to say that it's perfect. I just want to, as people hear me say this, I'm not romanticizing that. I'm just saying
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
a level of power that we're not. So, what do you think about the difference between what they have in that way as a power versus what diasporic people, mostly African descended kids in the United States, have in that way? We don't even have that level of determination over who gets to teach and what a school is, how a school is constructed and all that.
Yeah.
What's our particular lack of benefit? I don't know what it is
Mhm.
because of that you see.
Yeah, and you're so right. I'm hoping we can get Diana, on here soon to talk about Native American education. Like that's what she does, full time. And I forget how many schools she told me is within their system around the country. But in our case, there's one thing, and this is something I really, my next time that I'm taking like a just time off, I want to like dive deeper into this idea of like what would it look like for, if you want to be a teacher, you got to get certified. And while everybody talks about Finland, and what
Mm,
Finland has, and as
mhm.
far as their schools, what they never talk about is how few teacher certification programs they have, right? Like they might have three in the country. I get their country's the size of what, I don't know. I have no idea, but
Who, Finland?
yeah, what is it?
Finland's the size of
Texas,
Minnesota.
Minnesota. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So
It's about the same population, but I think about 5 million-ish people.
got it. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, so we're talking about 5 million versus, you know,
300 and something million, like a
300
real
something
country.
thousand. Yeah.
And they're
For
not
real.
very diverse. We're pretty
Yeah.
diverse. They're a lot like Minnesota,
Yeah, it's the
90%
same
white,
90%. Yeah. Yeah.
mostly Lutheran.
Mhm. And so you have this, like, and very few. Pennsylvania has, I'm just, and I knew this number a long time ago, but I'm gonna just throw a guess out there. Over 50 teacher certification programs just in Pennsylvania.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
all of these people, like, yep, you're certified to teach Black and brown kids, mostly diverse, population around the country, right? Yep, you're certified to teach Black and brown kids. Yep, you're certified. What I want to dive into that's, I think, very similar to the conversation you're talking about, like with indigenous education systems right now and how they're thinking about it. Suppose we had to, one, addressing that in some very strong, profound way, but then suppose you also had like a community certification, like you had
Mm,
to do something and you had to get it certified from community members. Like
mhm,
here are the spaces that you are going to teach. You're not only applying to that specific district, you're applying to serve in that community. And what
mhm,
would it look like for the community to give you, like, oh, well, what have you done in that community? What have you known about our community? Where show me your experience serving in this our community or similar to. Okay,
mhm,
and you haven't. So here's the mechanism, or here's the process and program that you're going to go through to get certified. It doesn't have to be separate, right, from how you get certified originally, right? Like it can
mhm,
be
mhm,
integrated in a way, but it has to be like a double green light system. The
mhm, mhm.
community is green lighting you, as well as the more structure. And I would still say the line should be closer to the community, right? Like it should be like, oh, 50-50. Suppose it was, you know 60-40, 70-30
Mhm.
community.
Let me
uh,
challenge this, Sharif,
yeah,
just quickly. Put a
good, because
challenge on
I
it.
want to spend time
Yeah.
thinking about this to flush it out and make it
Okay.
unchallengeable, but
So I'll give
it's
you,
nowhere near there yet.
and this is why, the world fund of information, as any people trying to liberate themselves, you can't think just about yourself. You have to think about the other people's struggles in other places to gain from them lessons around what other victims of colonialism have done to throw the yoke of colonialism off.
Mhm.
And then you can take lessons from people who are out of scope, like out of your area, for
Right.
creative purposes. Like
Mhm.
revolution has to be creative. So the Chiapas schools in northern Mexico, the indigenous people of northern Mexico, who were colonized just the same way that the indigenous people of the United States and Canada were, but in this case by the Mexican government, actually overthrew the government schools. They overthrew the entire education system and leveled it, and threw off the Mexican education system and rebuilt the Chiapas schools. So
Mhm.
anybody listening to me right now, you've heard me probably say this before, but please go Google it and go look it up, because it's a very big example. All their pedagogical kind of understanding of the world and everything is there, and you can see it. But they elected teachers. Their teachers were elected by the community after that. They weren't
Mhm.
like assigned by the government to a
Mhm.
school. Now
Mhm.
it's a position where the community has to elect you to be an educator.
Talk
And
about
then
elevating the profession. Like that's how you elevate the profession, bro.
and accountability, right? You're
Mhm.
accountable directly to the people. You're not accountable to some third party bodies that are outside of the people. So the
Mhm.
Chiapas schools, in this way, really threw off the yoke of colonial education. They rebuilt and re-indigenized their education for themselves. They rerouted themselves and their kids. And this all comes out of them seeing that their kids were being part of ethnocidal assimilation in ways that
Mhm.
was not working for them. So it's a very good story. There's a similar story in New Zealand with the Maori people. So
Yes.
the Maori in New Zealand had a similar problem, and just like natives in Mexico, Canada, the United States, their native people were put into boarding schools in New Zealand, and they saw them ethnocidal assimilation. That's what those schools were for. And they took their kids back. They started in kindergarten and then first grade and second grade. The original plan was to put the kids back into the traditional colonial schools once they had a good grounding. But what they figured out that was there was no good time to put them back in. Actually, their innovation.
Kindergarten, they're like, wait a minute, they've done so well. Why am I going to send them back into the mud and muck?
Well, they were like, oh, now maybe we should just keep them in the third grade, and the grades. So now the Maori people of New Zealand have a K-16 pathway. They even have a university, a Maori university in New Zealand, and that came out of them discovering the thing that we should all discover, which is their kids were never going to get a healthy education in the colonial system. That was their big aha at one point. You could keep reforming this thing all you want. That was their aha was we could keep, but when you said that racism is a distraction, they started to see reform as a distraction. Oh, you're only trying to make slavery better. Like you're only trying to make slavery a little bit more livable or whatever. That's what they saw reform as. Excuse me. And then they actually ended up having to do new systems. So those are two kind of out of African-American world examples of what's possible. And we have to think, how do you apply that to our diasporic ADOS, African descended people in the United States situation? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I do know though that, okay, I'm sorry. This is where I said I was going to challenge you. That wasn't a challenge to you.
I was about to say, I took all these notes. I'm I'm going to apply this to my thinking as I'm trying.
Here's the real challenge.
I appreciate that. All right. Good.
The real challenge is, I'm sorry for this. Yeah. So the real challenge is this, here's the real challenge to this is that the indigenous people, the Maori and the Chiapas, still had enough of their existing understanding of their roots and themselves and their indigenized understanding of the world and whatnot, that they knew enough to know when they were electing teachers that if you don't understand this stuff, you don't get to be a teacher. You shouldn't be elected. Our village has so been retrained over long periods of time that our own knowledge of things indigenous to ourselves is so low by design. That's been by design over years. So we didn't have reservations where we got to keep hope alive on our own cultural practices and understanding the world. We didn't have what Maori had or what the Ojibwe of Minnesota have or what the Chiapas schools in Mexico have. We actually were literally ethnocide in our case was complete. So we're almost complete. You're the one. You're the last remaining brother that is keeping the light on the old stuff.
But before we came on the show, you were talking about like one of the Babas. Like we got Africana. You know how in Marvel they're like we got a Hulk, we got an Africana car. You know what I mean? Like we got a Dr. Aisha Mani. We got it. You know what I mean? So imagine if because yes, they had specific spaces that they were doing this, and yes, I believe in many ways it made it easier. We were also in specific spaces, and we were doing that too, right? You talk about those 500 schools across the country that were built, right? Like literally right after, chattel enslavement, or in the midst of sharecropping and KKK and Reconstruction, deconstructing, Reconstruction, right? In the midst of all of that, that was still happening, right? And now today we have opportunities, but suppose we just have that kind of cultural intellectual revolution where we say, you know what, we got a Sankofa charter school, we got an Imhotep charter school, we got a Lotus Academy. Now we're at 3. And there's a few more,
and we got Kwanzaa.
Suppose yes, and more important, I think, than Kwanzaa, those 7 days, we have the principles that are 365, right? Because you're talking about like self-determination, collective work and responsibility, creativity, unity, cooperative economics. Okay, wherever you are, if you're at 0, get to 1. I'm talking about schools. If you're at 1, get to 3. You're 3, get to 5. Get 5, get to 10. Like, right? I think that's the piece that has to be a part of it. And then it's not just what's happening to our children. This is what we're building. Here are the institutions we are building. Because all those schools that you described, it reminds me of Freedom Schools of Mississippi,
Mhm.
Black Panther Liberation Schools, in various cities, and so many other independent Black schools. Like that's exact, even though they weren't all in one kind of swath of land, those spaces. My oldest son went to a school called Academy of the Way. And
Mm.
you know what way? The African way. Like that was the name of his school. And that was the ethos, the curricula, the educators, you know. Mama Elamisha was she was considered having one of those good government jobs. Mama Elamisha was just like, you know what, when she quit the post office after all those years, and before she reached like whatever retirement age, she was just like, you know what, I am, it's like in that book, James Anderson's book. You know what? I got a few pennies and they are for the education of Black children. That's what she did. She created Academy of the Way. And that's where my oldest son, Ali, went, and so many other children, right? But instead of building off of that, we ended up losing it. It went out of business, right? Because of usually, as usual, like finances. It was couldn't be sustained.
Mm.
But how about we double down on those academies of the way and start building those out? And this is for like pre-K, to I forget what grade it stopped in, because my kid was, kindergarten, pre-K and kindergarten when he attended there. Those are the schools. That's the stuff that we need to revisit. So we have like this, the Maoris, the Chiapas, they all started somewhere, and they probably started pretty small, you know,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
they had a resoluteness about, this ain't going to fail, because my kids' grandkids can't fail, and the seventh generation can't fail. And so we're putting a stake in the ground right now for this Academy of the Way, and continue to bolster it, support it, sustain it, so that it can continue to last, beyond anything that we can imagine in our own lifetime. Like, and at the end of the day, that's what it's about.
So, there's two things that I want to end with, and right now my camera is not letting me be excellent, but we will come back.
No
So,
worries. No
so
worries.
let me do one quick one, which is the teacher or the educator that's listening to this right now who feels like I am not steeped in all of this.
Mm.
I am attempting to be a very good teacher, all
Hmm.
that I can for the students that I have. I have lots of African American and African descended students in my classroom. I probably won't be able to fall down a rabbit hole anytime soon about the diaspora or pan-Africanism or any of these type of cultural rejuvenizing things that we need for the kids. I will spend a lot of time thinking about how to teach kids
Hmm.
how to read and how to do math or whatnot. What would you say to that educator who knows and is going to be very honest that they're not going to fall down the rabbit hole and really get into this stuff?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would say number one, understand what cultural proficiency is. You'll hear a lot about cultural competency, and it's like you arrive somewhere. Know that you have to constantly reflect and get feedback about how people are experiencing you as a teacher, your students, families, as well as colleagues, and supervisors. Like, how are you experiencing this, and what does cultural proficiency look like? Know that you can be culturally proficient towards one child and culturally destructive to that same child the next day. So it takes that
Mhm.
level of refining how you think. I was like, secondly, think about that child. What is their experience in your class in the perspective of what do they hear and see about themselves in your class, in your curricula? How do they see themselves, and what do they and how do they think about themselves, and what are you thinking about them? And meaning, if you're teaching science and you never talk about the contributions of women scientists, then that girl, how they're experiencing themselves in your class is that they don't exist and there have been no contributions, and we know that's a lie. And it
Mhm.
continues to reinforce the undermining of how they see themselves in the world of science. So you should be doing that for your students constantly. And then thirdly, read, study, learn. No matter what subject you teach, there are other people outside of white folks who contributed to that. Make sure you are learning about it, and so that you are incorporating that into your curricula. If you start there, reflecting, thinking, getting feedback, and studying and incorporating that, that's a start. Just start
Mhm.
there. Start there.
Mhm. So have a starting point.
Have a starting point and know that, like, hey, I want to go on this journey. But too many people like, I've arrived. I don't need to do that. I choose to drive over the bridge from my secluded white neighborhood and come teach these black and brown kids. So that means I can't have any racial biases. I chose to go. I spend gas. You know how much gas costs? I'm coming over here and driving. And I chose to be here in this under-resourced school. That means I am anything but racist.
Mhm.
That means you are.
That sounds like racist. It may not, you may not be racist, but that sounds racist-ish. So
Exactly.
just so you know. All right, I want to show you a picture, and I just want you quickly to tell me what you think is going on in this picture, right?
Uh-oh.
Because they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, right?
Uh-oh. You made me
Okay.
nervous already.
All right. So this is the picture.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Good old Uncle Sam indoctrinating. We got the kids in the front being disciplined. Cuba, Puerto Rico. Can't read that one. Philippines. Oh, Hawaii. Yeah. Students of color. Look who's washing the windows in the background. Like, oh, I was in those same seats. Run, kids, run. And then in the back, what do we have there? Can't see the wording, but those are our children those are the good kids, and
And the good
they
kids
are
on there,
being whitewashed
they have
intellectually.
Texas, Nebraska, Missouri, California. So
Yeah.
these are the American states. And then to the back door there, you have a native person who's reading a book upside down.
Hmm.
You
Asian
know,
kid trying to get in.
and Asian kids, outside looking in on all these and can't even get in the
Hmm.
building, right?
Hmm.
This is so much, and I should say, this is very old picture from from an artist that has a whole line of these from years ago that talk about the
Pictures
expansion.
old.
Yeah,
Mindset
so
is
it's first of all, those kids in the front row, you can look at their faces and see their, like their different levels
yeah,
of
that's those are the kids that
stuff.
get in the pink slips. Today they
Yeah.
get in the pink slips because, as you said, would you say the time they're like, they know something's wrong, so they're rebelling in school because they know, like, yo, they don't have the articulation of the language yet
Yeah.
to name what they're experiencing, but they know, like, this ain't how human being children supposed to be treated.
Yeah, and so there's so much to say about a picture like this, but it
Hmm.
captures a lot. Number one, it captures the paternalism. Look how tall and big Uncle Sam is with his long rod over
Hmm.
everybody. Look how small the countries are in dark. Look how and look at, there's no kind of difference. They're all Negro. Look at the difference between Hawaii and a place like Cuba or
Hmm.
Puerto Rico or the Philippines even, and how they're all like all the the natives people, the Asian outsider, whatnot. They're all equally dark and niggerized, which
Yeah,
is
they're like, these are the miscreants.
injustice. And these are miscreants, and they're so different than each other, but they're not.
Hmm.
In how they're viewed, and
That's it.
then
Their ride, it ain't four rides, it's one, and it's
yeah,
applied
absolutely.
liberally to all of them.
And the good people, the states, the compliant little kids sitting at their clean little desks in the back or whatnot, no eyes above their book that they're reading. They're perfectly compliant. They're not paying any attention to anything else going on in the room and these other people, and the way
That
these other
blackboard
people
in the
treat
back
them.
is
So
rich, right? England governed the colonies with or without their consent. The U.S. government will govern its new territories with or without their consent.
yeah, yeah, like this is the picture of white supremacy that we can't forget. And I would love to say to you this is why this is important to me, is the attitude of this picture that is expressed in this picture, the dynamics that are shown in this picture are not over today. The way that the United States looks at Cuba and Puerto Rico, even Hawaii and the Philippines as colonized territories, is the same as it ever was. The way that America looks at the native, the American Indian, in the back. What has really changed in this is probably the way that America sees the Asian now, with white folks seeing utility in the model minority myth. So maybe the Asian has gotten into the
And
room
some, depending on
with
what
this.
part of
So
Asia, right?
absolutely. Absolutely, because in some ways, Filipinos are Asian in one way, so they're not thinking that way. They're thinking mostly Chinese when they think of Asian, Chinese and Japanese. But this picture, if I were to be a teacher today that wanted to carry this picture into a high school classroom in Oklahoma, Texas, or Florida, and right, and talk about what's going on in this primary document. This is a primary source. This is a primary document. I could be fired. I could lose my license. As a matter of fact, in Oklahoma, I very possibly will be fired and lose my license for using this primary document. So Elaine Wells said there's no desk either for some of the folks in this room. So what a trip. We are still here today. We are still fighting to have our kids be taught in a humane system that knows too little about them to actually teach them in full, right? That's really our problem. And you gave a good answer to the teacher that is listening to this saying, I'm not going to go learn all this stuff about the African diaspora and the cultural rejuvenation that needs to take place to fill in the gaps for young people beyond math and reading and science and social studies as taught by my school. They're not going to do it, Sharif. And we're not going to invent a whole bunch of, African educated, babas like Dr. Carr who teach our kids every day anytime soon. So we have a maybe an outside of school cultural project that needs to happen.
Yes.
I think
that's where the cultural revolution got to start,
Yeah.
Outside, adjacent to school. It'll be some inside, but most of it's going to have to be outside, adjacent in our communities, and it needs to be relentless. Yeah. Absolutely relentless.
From top to bottom.
Yeah.
Relentless. All right. Well, listen, I appreciate you as always, Sharif. Thank you for giving your time on a Friday. To our friends and fam who have been watching and adding things. Some of y'all dropped a couple of resources in there and I appreciate it. I'll check them out later. If you haven't and you've been watching this, please drop in any resources into the comment thread that you think we should pay attention to and add to what will be an ongoing study guide and list from the Freedom Friday, these shows that we do. And as always, please share it with friends and with family. I apologize to y'all that my camera is not letting me be excellent today. It's about to shut off again. But here I am for like 30 seconds. See, there you go. Yeah. Don't fade to black. COINTELPRO in the house. Yeah. We appreciate y'all as always. This has been another episode of Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you are freer after this hour with Stewart El-Mekki and me. We will see you